Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to cover basically four key concepts that you really need to understand uh, to have a good understanding of how the tool is developed and structured, and to really be able to move into a good conversation around application, which, as I understand it, is one of the next places we're going to want to go with this. And the start is this slide right here. And this is really fundamental to everything we do. This is the basic framework for all of the modeling that exists within the system, and really describes kind of the underlying philosophy of what we're trying to accomplish with this tool. And at the outset, one of those big things is that we're trying to measure nature as a system. Ecosystems and ecosystem services are something that have relationships to each other that need to be captured. And that's something that historically we haven't done a good job at. And by we, I mean society as a whole. The tools that you see coming out so often measure one thing at a time. And that's really developed in large part because our academic system is structured that way, our regulatory system is structured that way. Everything is very siloed, very regimented into specific disciplines, and that's how we measure things. But that's not how the ecosystem works. So what we're trying to do with this is to move towards the ability to actually measure the system as a system. And that'll have some ramifications that we'll talk about when we start to get into 2, 3, and 4 of these four things. But just to explain this is, like I said, fundamental. It's the basic way in which we think about modeling and how we capture a snapshot of ecosystem performance. And it starts with understanding the attributes on the ground, right? So being able to characterize the vegetative structure, the soil composition, the water regime, the topography, and how all of those different aspects of the landscape contribute to whether or not ecological functions are performed. So our initial data input into the system are those attribute conditions, right? That's where it all starts. From that, we're able to really get a good understanding of how ecological functions are performed. But those ecological functions, those ecological processes that are happening on the landscape, they're coming together in their own relationships and their own structures to produce the outcomes that we talk about as ecosystem services. And I'm going to dive into that step a little more in the next slide, what we mean when we say ecological processes come together to produce ecosystem services. But ecosystem services, that's basically what nature is doing that enables us to survive and have quality of life, right? Without ecosystem services, we would have no air, we would have no climate, we would have no clean water, we would have none of the things that we actually rely on, and we wouldn't have the ability to enjoy nature and to go out and recreate in it. So it's a full suite of benefits that is beyond our ability to imagine at this point still. We're still thinking in new ways about what those ecosystem services include. But the one thing we know is that when ecosystem services are produced, they're produced in a location by a structure of attributes on the landscape, but the benefit that's produced is not static. It's not just experienced in that one place. It moves and flows across the landscape, and then will dissipate. The strength of that benefit will dissipate over time and or distance. So with every spot on the ground where a benefit is produced, we can map a service shed, which is basically the area in which that benefit is experienced, and identify the strength to which that benefit is still experienced. And that becomes important. We'll talk about that when we start thinking about applications and how you think about community impacts to activities that happen in a given location, like a facility that you may be working with. And then the final step is value. Now, we don't directly measure monetary value. We partner with people that have expertise in economics and the people that then do that monetary valuing, that measure natural capital outcomes of the ecosystem services that are produced. But there are a lot of ways of thinking about value, and in part that can just be how your stakeholders, the priorities your stakeholders have around the benefits that they're receiving from nature. And that's something that anyone, any planner, anyone out working with a community can assess and understand. The tool doesn't specifically give you that, but everything we do is tailored to provide a flow of outputs that will help you within um, that value step. Um, so the last thing I want to highlight is there are so many different ecosystem service types out there, and um, part of the balance that we're always trying to strike is being as comprehensive as possible, capturing the complexities that are out there in the ecosystem, but distilling it in a way that makes it usable and useful for people, meaningful in terms of the information flow it feeds into your decision-making processes. So to that end, we have grouped the ecosystem services into a number of buckets that can be used for reporting purposes. That's just for the convenience of the user, so that it can be put into reporting buckets, but that doesn't mean that you're limited to that. But what you'll see when we start looking at outputs in some of the future slides is they'll be broken into how well are you doing for air quality, for supporting biodiversity, for maintaining water quality, for supporting carbon and climate, for helping maintain the proper water cycle, for soil health, and for human health and well-being. There are a lot of services that go into each of those buckets. We have clustered them in a certain way because it's how most of our clients have tended to approach it. But the tool gives you the flexibility to think beyond those existing buckets when you start getting deeper into it. Let's move forward. So this is just a graphic way of thinking about the slide we just talked about. So instead of just putting the words on the slide, this is what it actually looks like in practice. We have all of these attributes on the landscape, plus we have climate factors, and that's something that also comes in that I didn't mention as an attribute, but the average rainfall that you get in a given location, the amount of solar radiation, the average temperatures, the growing season, all of those are also factors that are going to determine how ecological functions are performed and services are provided. And this is just showing the water quantity control, which is just another way of saying stormwater management. That specific service, when we think about it, what we start to understand when we look at this is not only is there a relationship between the different attributes as they enable functional processes to happen, there are relationships between the ecological processes themselves that we need to think about as we understand that next step to ecosystem services being produced. So in this instance, what this is showing is really the life history of a raindrop, right? You can think of it that way. As the rain starts coming down, the first thing that's going to happen to it is it's going to impact with vegetation. And that vegetation may intercept that rainfall and hold it within the canopy. And then that moisture that's held on the vegetation may re-evaporate into the atmosphere. All right, but there's eventually going to become a saturation point within the canopy, within that vegetative structure, where the rest starts moving through as throughfall and hits the ground, at which point infiltration will happen. And depending on your soil characteristics and the vegetative structure, the root structure, and how that's creating pore opportunities for the water to soak into the soil pathways, you're going to remove another part of rainfall from the equation. But eventually your soils are going to become saturated. And when they become saturated, you start to get runoff. And as you get that runoff, some of that may be captured in depressional areas and stored either in ponds or puddles or different depressional areas of different sizes. But then eventually those will fill up and the water is going to make its way into conveyance channels, right? That'll then move the water off to larger channels where it'll run off. Now, what we've described is 4 different functional processes that have a relationship in terms of how we think about their ability to contribute to water quantity control. So when we talk about needing to measure infiltration for water quantity control purposes, we shouldn't be measuring the full extent of the storm when we plug that into our equation, because there was an interception step that happened before that. And when we think about the surface storage capabilities of a site, we shouldn't be thinking about can it store the entire amount of the storm, but rather the amount that's left after interception, after infiltration, and then moved into storage. So there's a relationship here that needs to be captured. And that's the thing that's really critical from this is it's never as easy as just saying, well, I've got this attribute, this attribute, this attribute, and this attribute, I'm going to add them up, average them, and that's my score. That's not a way that we can really effectively measure ecosystem performance, because we have to be accounting for relationships every step of the way. Okay, so let's dive into one in particular. Let's dive into infiltration and look at a couple of things, how that fits into the equation, how that really, how you can start to see how the relationships emerge within each different step. And then I want to start talking about, well, so how do we understand how to score that performance? What are the compromises that are made in the modeling process so you can understand the level of resolution within the outputs and some factors like that. So starting at the very beginning, all right, and this is just a very simplified model construct for infiltration. We know that there are a couple of things we need to understand. One is the rate of infiltration that can happen given the substrate type, right? So if you have gravel, it's going to infiltrate, right? It's going to infiltrate very easily. If you have clay, we know that that's not going to allow for nearly as much infiltration. It's going to saturate fairly quickly. But that's not the end of the story, because vegetation plays an important role. Even within a clay structure, if you have a really effective root system, you're creating some pathways for infiltration to occur. Also, if you have basal cover, that's going to hold the moisture on top and increase residence time. That allows for a larger amount of infiltration. Now, this isn't intended to be a lecture on how does infiltration occur, but rather just pointing out that within that particular functional process, which you guys are probably very familiar with, there are relationships that we capture that have to be captured. And there are some things that are going to determine residence time, like slope, like microtopography, like basal cover, and those need to be captured within the model in the right place to capture those relationships and understand then ultimately what does that mean for the amount of water flowing off the site, right? So with every one of these that we do, it's a matter of bringing in subject matter experts, having the conversation about, okay, so what are those attributes that are contributing? How do they contribute? What's their relationship? What's the dynamic between them? Okay, now you can see that as we start to understand infiltration, that's plugging into our understanding of the different functional processes that we talked about before. The fact that it's sequential and that it needs to be calculated in that manner, where we're looking at interception, And then what's left, we're looking at infiltration. And then what's left, we're looking at water storage, because that's the way the life history of a raindrop actually happens in practice. So once we get through that, then we can start to understand, okay, what is the amount of benefit actually being provided here? How is nature performing that particular service in this particular location? So how does that actually turn into a model? Well, for every one of the attributes that we've identified, for every attribute, for every functional process it contributes to, we need to define a scoring curve for how does that contribution occur? What does it look like? How do we score that? How do we understand how if we add or subtract that attribute from the landscape or change the type of that attribute, how does that change performance? In this instance, we're just looking at litter duff. How does that contribute to infiltration? Well, it contributes by increasing residence time, right? I mean, it will to an extent also contribute to interception, but largely litter duff is acting as a big sponge, just holding that water so that if you have clay or silt soils, you're giving more time for that saturation uh, to resolve itself so that you can get more water flowing into the soils. And what this curve is showing is, if you have very limited coverage of litter and duff, it's really not going to do much. It's going to be negligible. You're not going to see it affecting your scores. But as you start to increase the amount of litter duff cover and get above 10%, now you really start to see an increase. And the more you have of it, the more of a sponge you have on your landscape, the longer the residence time is generally. So essentially, this becomes a very easy curve to draw. It's just a straight line. Now, this curve is going to look different for every attribute contributing to every different functional processes. Sometimes you'll hit a point of limited returns where you're going to get about 60% and that's going to peak, and then you get past that and you actually start to see a decline in performance. So you could have that type of curve, or you could have a curve that starts out very high, but the more you have, the lower your performance is. So every attribute contributes in its own unique way to every different function. And that's where you start to see the ability to really track how if you pull one thread in the system, there's a ripple effect. Because if you change that attribute and it's contributing differently to a bunch of functional processes, then what you're going to see is some will go up, some will go down. So that's where you start to see system level effects first arising in the outputs that we see. We talked about resolution. There is a compromise that happens at this stage, right? There's a balancing act between how robust can we make the system and how difficult is that system to implement. And this is something that we're actually going to see huge advances over the next decade, because right now the limiting factor for us is repeatability. How likely is it that if we send two people out on the site, they're going to come back with the same response for what is that attribute condition? Now, because of the way we do our scoring curves, we could do this as a continuous measure. We could ask you to go out and say, what is the actual percent cover for litter duff to the particular percentage point? But you'd send three people out and get three different results back. So as long as we're relying on visual observation, you have to have bins. Now we could narrow the size of those bins if we demand that you set up quadrats and go through a specific process for every different attribute that you're measuring. But now that extends the amount of time it takes to implement. So that becomes the balancing act. Now, the reason I say this is going to change over the next decade is as you start to get machine learning and AI capabilities, you start to get things like the ability to just point your phone at the canopy and it will tell you what is that canopy cover. Now, as we start to integrate that into the system, we can narrow the bends, resolution increases, and we don't lose repeatability. But currently, this is where the bends are set, right? And you'll see that when you start getting into data collection farther down the road. So keep that in mind. That's something that's shifting. We'll talk about that maybe just briefly a little bit more later. So once we've drawn scoring curves and created scoring tables for all of the different attributes, and we've defined what the relationships are between the attributes, so we've got a concept model that really shows us, okay, this is how we need to measure it. This is how this attribute relates to this attribute. And here's how we're going to score as we change the condition. All of that mess gets dumped in Morgan's lap because Morgan is the one that designs and creates the Bayesian belief networks in which we house all of our models. And we do that for a variety of reasons. And I'm going to let Morgan talk about that because he's the expert on that topic.
Yeah, thanks. So like Kevin was saying, this whole process of identifying what the scores are, what the scoring curves look like, and identifying the different attributes that need to feed into a given function or service, is all the kind of the foundational groundwork for building up these Bayesian belief network models. And we like Bayesian belief network models because they allow us to incorporate various different types of data into a single model, and they allow us to build expert-derived models from subject matter experts in the absence of empirical data that we can necessarily draw from. So in places where we don't have large data sets of very specific on-the-ground attribute level data, we can use literature that we've gone through, and we can use subject matter expert input to derive relationships between these different attributes and build out these different models. And so this graphic that we're looking at here, this is the insects and invertebrates model, and you can see it's big and it's complicated, but we can kind of break it down into these smaller components. Yeah, so if we look across, there's kind of two lines that stand out here, and those are the green ovals, and those are the individual input attributes for this model. And so there's repetition of some of those green ovals as we kind of step through the different sections of the model here. On the left-hand side, you can see that we have aquatic and flowing water, which is one submodel or subcomponent to this model. In the middle, we have aquatic and still water. And then on the right, we have terrestrial. And then down in and those are all for the insect invertebrate support for cover and refugia. And then if we move down to the bottom row here, we have insect invertebrate support for nesting and spawning. So a different life cycle stage or life history stage. And on the bottom, it's just broken out into two different components, aquatic versus terrestrial, because the still water versus flowing water distinction doesn't make as big a difference when we're looking at this in the bottom for nesting and spawning. So overall, if we look at the overall kind of structure here, we have those input attributes, which are the green nodes across the top, and then we have lines coming down from those, and those lines are links, and they indicate a relationship between those input attribute nodes and these intermediate calculations, which are in the gray boxes, the initial gray boxes that we run into there. And so each of those initial gray boxes is used to identify what the relationship is between those input nodes, those input attributes, to get us at some sub-calculation for the score for that particular sub-model. And then and as you can see, we do this for flowing water, still water, or terrestrial, depending on which environment we're looking at for a given survey unit or a given area that we're investigating. It'll get routed into one of those three, and then whatever the output score, the final output score for that particular habitat, for that particular life history stage, gets passed out into the final insect invertebrate support score. And that's what we see in the bottom right corner here. And we'll zoom in just a little bit more, but actually, let's go ahead and do that, zoom in a bit more. So looking specifically at the terrestrial submodel for this, you can see across the top here, we have all of the individual scoring tables that are derived from those scoring curves that Kevin was talking about. And those are scoring tables that are associated with each of these individual input attributes. And if we look across from the left, particularly for terrestrial and cover refugia. You can see that in the green nodes, we have percent downwood cover. We have number of downwood decay classes, which are both really significant components of the overall insect invertebrate model. We have average depth of litter and duff, also very significant, and then overhanging vegetation, looking at kind of the general veg cover. And then as we continue moving across from left to right, we've got the different substrate components. And so we've got organics, we've got clay, silt, sand, gravel, cobble, rock, and boulder. And each of those contribute differently to the overall substrate composition component of this model based on those scoring curves that were used to derive the scoring tables up above. And so you can see things like higher scores coming in for gravel cobble than you have necessarily coming in for clay, because gravel cobble has a potential to support a broader array of insect invertebrate cover refugia scores than clay as an individual component does. And all of those get brought together to give us a substrate component score, and then that gets combined with the, in this case, hibernation for upland, sub calculation there. And then all of that eventually, and that hibernation for upland component brings in the downwood and the downwood decay classes, etc. And then that all rolls up into the final insect invertebrate cover refugia score down below. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see how we bring together it's hard to see because it's very small, but insect invertebrate cover refugia score on the left, and then the insect invertebrate insect nesting score on the right there. And then those two come together to provide our overall final insect invertebrate support score. And this just kind of brings all of those different components that Kevin's been talking about with together into our kind of final models. And then this concept model is then moved over into an actual Bayesian belief network modeling framework. We're currently using a system called Genie, which is the framework that we use. Okay.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, Morgan.
You're welcome.
Okay. So last piece on this first step that we're going to talk about, and this just gets at the data collection a little bit more, just to flesh this out some. Currently, there are 3 different ways data comes into the system. Most of it is field collected data when we're talking about the design tool. In the screening tool, obviously, the data is already there. It's pre-populated, and we talked about how that gets into the system. But most of the data is field collected, but there is also remotely sensed data that's already in there, existing data sets that we're drawing from, particularly with the climate attributes, right? Most of that is drawn from NOAA sources or the European Space Agency in Europe, or different global data sets that help fill that in. So that's something that the user doesn't necessarily need to worry about. A lot of it is auto-populated or easily obtained. When you identify where you are on the landscape, it'll fill in the stuff that is easily auto-populated. The place where we are going to be moving as much as possible into the future is the AI machine learning to help, like we were talking about earlier, enable us to narrow the bends so that the resolution can be increased. We have also talked about modifying the system to enable different user levels to have different sized bins based on the level of data collection rigor that they're willing to put into it. So you would have specifically prescribed data collection protocols that had to be used to use those narrow bins. We're not there yet, but that's something we've looked at is might be useful for some types of users. So we're interested in input on that as we move forward. But this is the last piece, and this is one where we see a lot of change happening in the future. So happy to have those conversations and hear thoughts and suggestions from people over time on this piece. Okay, so we're going to move into the second part now, and I just want to pause and say, the first part of this is really reflects, again, kind of that balance that happens here. Whenever you design a decision support tool, at least from our perspective, there is a balance that has to happen in terms of the extent to which you are able to capture nuance and complexity. And that has to be balanced with the extent to which the user doesn't necessarily need to get bogged down in that nuance and complexity, right? So you want to be robust, but you want to be user-friendly too. So the first part of this is, how do we manage to get that robust and nuanced data and outputs into the system and out of the system, so that, you know, the outputs that we're providing you reflect a system, reflect how the ecosystem performs, not these different snapshots of different siloed aspects of nature, but an integrated nature. So that's on the one side, but then it needs to be an easy user experience. It needs to be something that provides an information flow that can be easily assimilated and integrated into project decision-making processes. So moving into number two, and this starts to go a lot quicker. The idea of units of measure, the initial unit of measure we use is a functional acre, functional hectare, service acre, service hectare. If you're from a wetland background, this concept is pretty basic to you. All right, there are a lot of functional assessments that use a functional acre as their output. It's becoming more universally adopted. For instance, natural capital accounting uses functional acres as their condition for their condition accounts, for example. So it's becoming more popular and more universal, but there are still a lot of people out there that are just baffled by this particular unit of measure. So if it doesn't make instantaneous sense to you, that's okay. You're with the majority of the population, I think. But it's actually a fairly basic way of understanding things. It's looking at both quality and quantity in a single unit. So the example we have here, the system on the left, is an intact ecosystem performing really well. So for infiltration, when we go out and we measure it, it's probably performing at 80%. Now, important to understand, if you're seeing something performing at 100%, you're probably in a managed system and it's being managed for that particular purpose. Natural systems do not do many things at 100%. They tend to have a distribution of benefits that they're providing, and everything needs to be balanced. That means nothing is maximized, everything is optimized. So 80% is actually a pretty high level. And it's 10 acres. So what is the total amount of benefit that society is receiving from this? It's 8 functional acres. Now, build a road through it, you're going to see your level of infiltration decrease. If it drops down to 30%, you now have 3 functional acres. This is really useful for a couple of things. One, it's useful for understanding the consequences of impacts or benefits that you're providing through interventions or development activities. You can really quantify that pretty effectively. But the biggest thing, and the reason we use it as our primary output, is it enables us to look at every single function, every single service in the same unit of measure. So now you have a like for like analysis where when you change attributes on the landscape, you can actually see the ripple effect through the system and do a comparative analysis in a way that's meaningful. If you're measuring air quality in parts per million and you're measuring water quality in milligrams per liter, it's hard to equate those two, right? And then you add biodiversity where you may be using, number of species present on the site. How do you bring those 3 together? It's very difficult. So this is our primary unit of measure. Now, I will say that there are times when that absolute measure of parts per million or milligrams per liter, which we refer to as engineering units, is necessary. If you're comparing green versus gray solutions, or nature-based solution versus an engineered solution. You have to be able to reconcile that natural outcome with the engineered outcome, and that engineered outcome is going to be measured in that absolute measure. So that is available in the system for specific services, functions and services where it's relevant. It can be very useful for evaluation processes and for doing those types of direct comparisons. But otherwise, this is the initial way we see those outputs reflected. And this is then what it looks like. You can do a very quick snapshot where you look at your reference on the right. This is how nature in a highly functioning condition for your biome would be performing those services. And this is what your site currently is. And you can see then the gap very quickly reflected in terms of how much benefit is being produced from each. Okay, so reference performance. I'm going to talk about this very quickly. It's something you might want to have more conversation on at a later date, but how do we get those reference performance benchmarks? Where do they come from? And basically, they're done at a biome level. Within every biome, there's good mapping of habitats within those biomes, and it's easy for us, relatively easy. I say it's easy because someone else is doing it. It may take them time, but they can access this data fairly readily. In terms of the prevalence of each habitat type within the various biomes. So we can understand within a biome, what are the habitats that are most common? And we've got data that tells us for highly functioning habitats of that type within that biome, how does relatively undisturbed, highly functioning habitat perform? And that becomes then the basis for the reference. Now, nature doesn't exist in a single habitat here and a single habitat there. It exists in mosaics across a landscape. So when we understand reference, it's important to understand that mosaic of habitats and how they come together to perform the benefits that are needed within that biome. So the way we calculate our reference is by looking at the prevalence of each habitat type and doing a weighted average for the scores that they're feeding into the system. So if your system is, if your biome is comprised 50% of forest, then those forest performance scores are going to contribute 50% to the overall reference values that we see for that biome. Now, you may be in a part of your biome where it's skewed differently. The system allows you to adjust to reflect that if it's necessary. Now, the other aspect of that is we also know that certain habitat types are disappearing within biomes faster than others due to agricultural expansion, urban growth. So, for instance, wetlands have been frequently lost in a lot of the different biome types. That is also accounted for to the extent we're able to. So we can go back 40 years and look at the land cover change over the last 40 years. And that then is reflected as a weighting value to account for the loss of those habitats over time. So that's where the reference benchmarks come from. Okay. So then that's how this is reflected. You can see the biome reference is included every time you get your outputs. You will see that as the scoring stack on the right is always going to be your reference. That's how you know whether something is good or bad, because for a lot of things, there is no absolute good, no absolute bad. What there is divergence from natural preference, right? And that's what we're trying to measure. Scoring 60% for air quality may be really good in one biome and may be marginal in another, right? It just depends on what is typical for your biome. What does that biome suggest is the appropriate balance within the geography that you are working? Okay, so let's move into the final piece, which is the ecosystem integrity score. So we talked about the balance and having something that's robust and meaningful, but easy to understand, easy to digest, easy to present to a decision maker, right? And this is kind of that final step in that balance. We've always been very hesitant to aggregate up to a single number. It's just when you aggregate data, you lose so much meaning, so much nuance can be lost. So we've always been hesitant about encouraging aggregation, but in this instance, it's an aggregation that actually tells us something that the disaggregated numbers don't. And I will provide an example of that um, in a second. Okay, so how do we calculate the ecosystem integrity score? It's a combination of all of the services that are feeding into the category that you see. So when you see the output, it'll be for the 7 different categories, but all of the services that feed into those categories are used to calculate ecosystem integrity. And what it's telling us is we know that within a particular biome, nature thinks that the ideal level of performance for air quality support or carbon and climate or water cycle is X, Y, or Z, right? It'll tell us this is how nature would perform in this location. And what our ecosystem integrity value is telling us is how close are you aligning with what nature would prefer to happen in that location. And that's an important thing to understand for a couple of reasons. Now, our basic outputs, they tell you the total amount of benefit being provided. And if you really take the time, you can break it down into the individual categories and get a feel for, okay, so I'm definitely losing a little bit of each except for the dark blue. And that's not an easy way to do that type of analysis, right? What is more useful is for us to actually tell you that you are misaligned in this area or this area. So with these, the thing it tells you very quickly is the amount of benefit being produced is going down as you look at your baseline versus your as-built versus your design with additional interventions versus what nature would expect. And it's important to understand this because if you are overperforming in certain areas, say you decided that the water cycle is critical for you, or carbon, is a common thing that people decide, I have to meet my carbon goal, so I'm going to overperform in carbon. Uh, there are consequences to that because if you're designing your system to maximize for carbon, something's going to give. A lot of times it's biodiversity, and we'll see an example of that. But it's also the case that the system on the left, that biome, rich, vibrant, supports a lot of different services very well because of climate conditions, because of factors that enable that to exist. Move to a desert xeric shrubland biome, you are not going to be able to replicate that. So it's important that what you are designing is designed to match the needs of the biome. And this then tells you whether you're doing that. So this example, you can see on the left, scenario 1, this is your baseline. The gray is your reference. That's what nature would do. The blue is your baseline. Whoever designed this site did a good job of improving upon baseline. They've expanded it some. They could have done better. You see the scenario 2 where you've put in a lot more interventions and focused on a little more. You get up to where you are very close to replicating a natural system, and that's really good performance. But if you're thinking, someone comes in and says, hey, but our carbon goals, and causes you to really focus your interventions more towards carbon, and you do really dense plantings of spruce trees to try to improve carbon uptake. But spruce isn't native to your biome, and planting it in those thick rows is not conducive to supporting biodiversity, you're actually going to see a biodiversity loss, right? So your ecosystem integrity score is going to drop. And that's how we need to understand what nature positive is. Are we moving towards having more nature that is highly functioning like scenario 2 is, in alignment with natural systems? And that's a very important thing to understand. And the ecosystem integrity scores provide that as a very quick snapshot. So it's combining data in a way that is enhancing and enriching the information flow and making it easily assimilatable within your decision-making process. Okay, last thing, we talked about movement and flows. I'm not going to spend much time on this because it's not in the system yet as something that you can do easily, but it's something that we do off book and that we're integrating into the system as we have the opportunity. But really important as we start to think about applications as the next step, to understand geographic extent of impacts, where benefits are being provided and where benefits are lost as we change the nature of the conditions on the site. This is just an example from a site where it's an agricultural system, and the idea was, how are we going to impact all those agricultural producers if we change pollination or increase pollination on the project site? And you can see that that can really have an effect on how you engage with the community and think about how your project is going to impact communities around you. Okay, that's a very rapid cruise through of some of the specifics and details of how the system is structured, the decisions we've made along the way, the balancing that we've tried to do within the system.